Every human being is born with a brain that's designed to eat, not to diet. At the most fundamental level, the brain's primary goal is survival, and food is central to that mission. When the neural circuitry that governs hunger, satiety, and reward becomes dysregulated, eating disorders begin to emerge. These aren't weaknesses or flaws in character, they are misfires in deeply embedded systems wired into the hypothalamus, the prefrontal cortex, and the mesolimbic dopamine pathways. Understanding this changes everything. It shifts the blame from self-judgment to science, from shame to strategy. Take anorexia, for instance. At its core, it's a condition where food restriction becomes neurologically rewarding. The act of saying no to food creates a surge in dopamine for some individuals. That surge, typically reserved for behaviors like goal achievement or social validation, is now tethered to starvation. Over time, the brain begins to associate control with safety, and eating becomes a threat. This isn't about vanity, it's about survival gone sideways. A neurological loop where the person is no longer in control, but the loop is. Bulimia follows a similar pathway, but adds a second component, purging. After an episode of binging, often driven by stress, emotion, or dysregulated appetite signals, the person feels trapped and out of control. The purge becomes a release valve, and tragically, that relief, though short-lived, activates the brain's reward system. It says, this behavior helps you cope, even as it damages the body. Now consider binge eating. It's not just about willpower, it's about a brain that has learned to associate food with emotional regulation. Chronic stress, trauma, and sleep deprivation all downregulate the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the brain's fear and emotional processing center, becomes overactive. In that neurological landscape, food becomes a drug. The same dopamine spike seen in addicts is mirrored in those who binge. But unlike drugs, food is something we need to live, and that makes the cycle even harder to escape. The gut plays a massive role here too. The gut-brain axis isn't some vague wellness term, it's a biological reality. Over 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut, and it communicates with the brain via the vagus nerve. An unhealthy gut microbiome, whether due to restrictive eating, overconsumption of processed food, or chronic stress, can lead to inflammation that alters brain chemistry. This affects mood, decision-making, and appetite regulation. When the gut is sick, the brain is foggy. When the brain is foggy, eating decisions become reactive instead of intentional. There's also a hormonal trap at play. Ghrelin and leptin, the hormones that govern hunger and fullness, can become completely dysregulated by erratic eating patterns. Cortisol, the stress hormone, elevates under restrictive diets or excessive fasting, making the person more anxious, more obsessive, and less capable of rational decision making. In other words, the very behaviors used to control food become the ones that deepen the disorder. But there is hope. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself, is real. With the right inputs, neural circuits can be reshaped. This means building daily protocols that ground the nervous system, such as morning sunlight exposure, deliberate breath work. The brain's primary function is to keep us alive, and one of its oldest, most deeply embedded systems is the drive to eat. But when this natural system becomes dysregulated, whether by stress, trauma, social pressures, or genetic vulnerability, it can spiral into disordered patterns that are deeply resistant to logic or willpower. Anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating are not simply choices or behaviors. They are reflections of neural misfiring in critical circuits involving the hypothalamus, amygdala, insula, and prefrontal cortex. When someone develops anorexia, for example, it's often not about the desire to be thin, but about the need for control, the soothing ritual of routine, or the sense of calm that restriction produces in the brain. It becomes a form of self-regulation. Over time, the brain links the act of denying food to reward via dopamine spikes. Every skipped meal becomes a signal of success to a system that's confused survival with starvation. In this loop, eating starts to feel threatening while hunger feels safe. In bulimia, the pattern is different, but the neural dynamics are still at play. A binge often begins with emotional dysregulation, a flood of feelings the nervous system cannot manage. Food becomes a numbing tool, offering a temporary serotonin boost and calming the overactive amygdala. But then the aftermath, guilt, panic, and the compulsion to purge. Purging itself becomes a source of perceived relief, activating the reward circuits that reinforce the behavior. In binge eating disorder, there's often no purge, but the same cycle of seeking emotional regulation through food exists. This isn't simply poor decision making, it's a breakdown in the brain's reward hierarchy. Normally, Well, there's another critical player in this system, the gut. We now know the gut is home to trillions of microbes that not only assist in digestion, but also produce key neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA. When the gut is inflamed, malnourished, or imbalanced due to erratic eating habits, it sends distress signals to the brain. This can lead to increased anxiety, poor mood regulation, and even misperceptions of hunger and satiety. Many people with eating disorders also experience gastrointestinal issues, not as a side effect, but as part of the root problem. This is the gut-brain axis in action, and it is bidirectional. Heal the gut, and the brain begins to stabilize. Stabilize the brain, and the gut begins to heal. The problem is, most interventions miss this loop entirely. That's why healing must be holistic. It's not just about eating more or less. It's about resetting the system. Recovery requires the engagement of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change in response to new inputs. The same pathways that were wired to associate food with fear or relief can be rewired to associate food with nourishment, calm, and safety. But this takes consistent, deliberate action. Morning sunlight to set the circadian rhythm and stabilize cortisol. Structured meals to re-regulate ghrelin and leptin. Cold exposure to teach the nervous system resilience. Daily movement to enhance dopamine without triggering obsession. And most importantly, connection. Real human relationships that remind the brain it is not alone in its pain. These protocols act like behavioral nutrients. They feed the nervous system. And over time, they help the brain trust again. The human brain is built for survival, and food is one of its primary tools. From the moment we wake up, circuits in the hypothalamus, brainstem, and limbic system are evaluating the body's energy needs and sending signals about hunger, satiety, and reward. These systems are designed to keep us alive and balanced. But when something disrupts this neurobiological harmony, whether it's trauma, stress, social comparison, or biochemical imbalances, the very systems built to protect us begin to turn against us. Anorexia nervosa, for example, is not simply about wanting to be thin. It's about how the brain adapts to restriction and begins to reward it. When someone consistently restricts food intake, the brain responds by releasing dopamine in anticipation of control, not nourishment. Over time, this loop grows stronger. Food becomes dangerous. Hunger becomes a symbol of discipline. The brain begins to feel safe in the absence of food, not because it is. Bulimia presents a different cycle, but one equally rooted in neuroscience. For those who suffer from it, there's often a buildup of emotional tension, anxiety, shame, restlessness that becomes unbearable. The act of binging temporarily soothes the nervous system, especially the limbic regions responsible for processing emotion. It floods the body with dopamine and serotonin, creating a momentary sense of calm. But then comes the crash. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment and reflection, reactivates, leading to overwhelming guilt and self-rejection. Purging then becomes the next phase, not just to remove food, but to erase the shame. Tragically, this purge is also rewarded by the brain with a small surge of relief. And just like with addiction, the brain learns that this entire cycle, binge, purge, relief, is worth repeating. Binge eating disorder, though it lacks the purge component, follows a similar loop. Beyond the emotional and cognitive elements, there is also the powerful role of the gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication system between the digestive system and the brain. The gut produces neurotransmitters like serotonin and communicates directly with the central nervous system through the vagus nerve. When the gut microbiome is disrupted due to inconsistent eating patterns, malnutrition, or high levels of stress, it sends distorted signals to the brain. This can lead to anxiety, depression, foggy thinking, and unstable appetite regulation. In essence, the brain begins to misinterpret the body's true needs. People may feel hunger when they're not hungry, or fullness when they've barely eaten. This breakdown in internal signaling makes recovery even more complex. It's not just about choosing to eat differently. It's about repairing a communication system that has been deeply damaged. And healing this system requires more than food. It requires time, consistency, and a nervous system that is gradually retrained to feel safe in the presence of nourishment. Fortunately, the brain is changeable. Through the process of neuroplasticity, it can be rewired. This is where true recovery begins, not with willpower, but with repetition. One of the most powerful tools for this is structured daily routines. Morning sunlight exposure stabilizes circadian rhythms, which directly influence appetite-regulating hormones like leptin and ghrelin. Deliberate cold exposure strengthens the stress response system, teaching the brain that it can handle discomfort without panic. Breathwork activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing cortisol and improving digestion. Movement, especially rhythmic, non-obsessive exercise, boosts dopamine naturally without the destructive patterns of binging or restriction. These tools are not fringe. They are evidence-based practices that support the entire neurobiological structure involved in eating behavior. When implemented consistently, they begin to undo the neural loops that drive disordered eating. Food becomes less threatening, the body becomes less of an enemy, and the individual starts to feel that healing is not just possible, it's happening. One rewired circuit at a time. The foundation of human survival is built upon the brain's relationship with food. This connection is not superficial, it is ancient, intricate, and deeply tied to our biology. Long before we had mirrors or social media, the human nervous system evolved mechanisms to regulate hunger, satiety, and energy balance. These systems are governed primarily by regions like the hypothalamus and brainstem, which constantly scan internal signals to determine whether the body needs nourishment. When functioning properly, this system cues us to eat when we're hungry and stop when we're full. But in a modern world flooded with unrealistic body standards, chronic stress, processed foods, and emotional trauma, this system often gets dysregulated. That dysregulation is not a personal failure, it is neurobiology adapting to chaos. In eating disorders like anorexia, the normal pathways of hunger are overridden by a powerful reward response to restriction. Instead of food feeling safe, it feels dangerous. Instead of hunger being uncomfortable, it becomes addictive. The individual isn't trying to be extreme, their brain is simply stuck in a loop that reinforces self-denial as safety. In bulimia, the dysfunction takes a different form. Here, the cycle typically begins with stress or emotional overload, situations where the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and long-term planning, goes offline. The emotional brain, particularly the amygdala, hijacks the system, creating a desperate need for relief. That relief often comes in the form of binge eating. Large quantities of food trigger dopamine release and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, momentarily calming the internal chaos. But this calm is fleeting. Guilt and panic set in almost immediately. The individual feels the need to regain control, and purging provides that illusion. Vomiting, laxatives, or overexercising aren't simply about removing calories. They are attempts to purge shame, fear, and loss of control. And tragically, the brain learns to associate purging with emotional release, reinforcing the behavior as a solution, even though it's part of the problem. Binge eating disorder, while lacking the purge element, still follows a brain-based loop. Parallel to these behavioral loops, the gut-brain axis plays an invisible but powerful role in shaping eating behavior. The gut is often referred to as the second brain, and for good reason. It produces over 90% of the body's serotonin, regulates immune responses, and sends constant signals to the central nervous system through the vagus nerve. When gut health deteriorates through disordered eating, poor sleep, or chronic stress, this communication becomes distorted. The result is often mood instability, heightened anxiety, brain fog, and impaired appetite signals. People may feel full when they're starving or hungry when their body doesn't need food. This misalignment between sensation and reality is deeply disorienting. It reinforces the false belief that the body is untrustworthy, and that belief drives further restriction, binging or purging. Repairing this communication loop is a critical part of recovery. It involves not just refeeding the body. The most encouraging truth in all of this is that the brain can change. Neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to rewire itself in response to new experiences, is a scientifically proven fact. No matter how long someone has lived with an eating disorder, healing is possible, but it doesn't happen through intention alone. It happens through action, small, repeatable inputs that reshape neural circuits over time. These inputs include structured eating times that rebuild trust in food, exposure to natural light early in the day to regulate cortisol and energy balance, breath work and meditation to re-engage the prefrontal cortex and downshift the stress response, gentle, consistent movement that reclaims the body not as an enemy, but as an ally, and most importantly, human connection, real relationships that provide safety and perspective. The human brain has evolved to keep us alive, and food is one of its most essential survival tools. At the center of this process is the hypothalamus, a deep brain structure that monitors our internal energy state and signals when we need to eat. Alongside it, the brainstem, limbic system, and reward circuits all play roles in driving us toward nourishment, but the same system that helps us survive can be thrown off course by chronic stress, emotional trauma, societal pressures, and inconsistent eating habits. When this happens, the normal biological feedback loop between hunger and satiety becomes distorted. Anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating are not simply disorders of behavior. They are the result of altered brain wiring. The individual isn't choosing disorder. The brain is responding to pain in the only way it knows how. In anorexia, the act of not eating gets linked to reward. Bulimia follows a different but equally powerful path. It begins with emotional intensity, stress, anxiety, shame, which the brain cannot regulate. The binge provides a short-term flood of calming chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins. It is a moment of silence in the emotional storm. But immediately after, the brain's executive function kicks in, triggering guilt and panic. That's where purging enters. Not just to undo the eating, but to release the built-up emotion. The purge, like the binge, is temporarily rewarding. It creates a false sense of relief, a clean slate, which the brain learns to crave. Over time, this becomes a self-reinforcing loop. Binge to relieve the emotion, purge to relieve the guilt. In binge eating disorder, the purge is absent, but the emotional trigger is the same. The brain learns to use food as a regulator of feelings, and because eating does produce calming neurochemicals, the behavior is biologically reinforced. The issue is not gluttony. It's a nervous system trying to find relief. Adding to this complex picture is the gut-brain axis. This communication network, primarily driven by the vagus nerve and the microbiome, is foundational to mental and emotional regulation. The gut is home to trillions of bacteria that produce neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA, both of which directly influence mood, anxiety, and decision-making. When the gut is compromised by restrictive eating, processed foods, poor sleep, or chronic stress, the signals it sends to the brain become confused or even inflammatory. This can lead to misperceptions of hunger, mood swings, irritability, and disconnection from internal cues. For someone with an eating disorder, this worsens the divide between what the body needs and what the brain believes. Healing this relationship means healing the gut, not just for digestion, but for mood, clarity, and emotional resilience. Gut health is not separate from brain health. They are two sides of the same system. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change, is the cornerstone of recovery. The same circuits that learn to fear food or depend on binging can learn new associations. The key is repetition. Morning light helps regulate circadian rhythms and hormones like ghrelin and leptin, which influence hunger. Breath work and meditation activate the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing fight or flight responses that lead to impulsive eating behaviors. Cold exposure, when used appropriately, trains the nervous system to tolerate discomfort and teaches the brain that control doesn't come through food but through resilience. Structured meals teach the brain to expect food at regular times, lowering anxiety and retraining hunger signals. Movement, not as punishment but as celebration, helps rewire the body-brain connection. These habits may seem simple, but they speak directly to the systems driving disorder. They are not hacks, they are biological tools. Perhaps most importantly, healing requires connection. Isolation is one of the most powerful reinforcers of disordered eating. When someone is alone in their thoughts, especially thoughts shaped by years of dysregulated eating, the brain turns inward and the loops grow stronger. Human connection offers something that food, restriction, or purging never can: regulation. When we are seen, heard, and accepted, our nervous system calms. Oxytocin levels rise, cortisol falls, the prefrontal cortex re-engages. In that state, the brain is able to receive new information, integrate truth, and make decisions from clarity rather than compulsion. This is why support from therapists, peers, family, and community isn't optional. It's biological medicine. The path to healing doesn't lie in willpower or control. It lies in regulating the brain and body through consistent inputs that rebuild safety, connection, and trust. When the nervous system is calm, when the gut is balanced, and when the mind is supported, the individual can slowly begin to rewire their relationship with food. And from that place, healing is not just possible, it becomes inevitable.